Hello, I'm Liam Gammon, and this is New Mandala TV. I'm a PhD candidate at the Department of Political and Social Change at the ANU's College of Asia and Pacific. I'm joined here today by Greg Feely, who researches Islamic politics and religious life in Indonesia. I'm with Arianto Patunru, who is an economist at the ANU's Indonesia project, and a fellow political and social change PhD candidate, Eve Warburton, who studies the politics of resource nationalism in Indonesia. Now, as we're recording this video, President Joko Widodo, or Jokowi, as we'll henceforth refer to him, is in Washington, D.C., and he's about to have a dinner in his honor with John Kerry. He's about to meet Barack Obama in the Oval Office and be feted by US business leaders and, most importantly, have dinner with the CEO of Apple. Now, just a few years ago, if I'd have said the mayor of Solo would be meeting with Barack Obama in the Oval Office, people would have looked at you as if you were a bit crazy. Nevertheless, it's happened. So in a sense, it's only been quite recently that we've really got a feeling for the kind of man that Jokowi is and the kind of political leader that he is. So I just want to open up this chat today by asking, what do you think is the most interesting or surprising thing that we've learned about Jokowi, the man, his character, in his first 12 months? Something that that wasn't revealed to us, wasn't apparent before he became president.
Well, if I start, it has been a meteoric rise, but in some ways, at least from where I stand, Jokowi has become a more enigmatic figure the higher he has risen. And when we hear some of the stories from the palace, reported in the media and elsewhere, about how his personal behaviour is changing, how he's becoming more formal and the like, he is clearly a politician in the process of development. I think one of the things that's surprised about the last year has been the lack of political fortitude that he's shown, particularly in facing down other powerful forces in his coalition. His willingness to compromise on matters that we previously thought were very dear to him, such as having reform-minded, economically rational people in the cabinet, people with strong track records. Most of those things were unexpected. And I, for one, am still not sure what the prospects are for Jokowi to improve his presidential performance in the remaining 4 years, because in some ways he's slightly improved his position. In other ways, I think we seem to have a fairly fixed pattern of him not paying attention to a whole lot of reform issues, focusing on economic issues, but most importantly of all, not doing anything to cause ructions within his cabinet. And that means that he has become a politician much like many of the people whom he's replaced.
Essentially, it's business as usual. Is that the feeling for what the next 4 years heralds?
Largely it's that. There are some distinctive things about Jokowi, the people he has around him. In some ways, the people whom he trusts most, in some ways, are a different kind of person to the kind of people that SBY or Megawati would have had around them. But nonetheless, I think he is still far too concerned about political stability, and he has no sense of brinksmanship about him. And really, for him to have broken through those conventional boundaries of Indonesian politics to really put a distinctive stamp on his presidency, he needed to have an element of that taking on his enemies. And that would have seen, I think, an entirely different dynamic in politics now in Indonesia. But I suspect a great many of the coalition partners feel that they have his measure, and they know if they put pressure on him that he will yield.
The economy and the president's outlook on the economy is one of those areas where the evidence is so confounding and confusing. So I want to ask you, Pa Arianto, for the first, I suppose, 9 or 10 months or so of the administration, they came in for some very, very heavy criticism about interventionist and protectionist policies on trade, restricting the ability of expatriates to work in Indonesia, making price controls and so on and so forth.
Right.
Yet in the last few months, we've got a real kind of change in tone in some areas. The appointment of Thomas Lembong, a real man of a real liberal persuasion as trade minister, a change in rhetoric from the palace, which focuses upon improving the business climate. And
Right.
for the last few fortnights, we've seen this drip feed of announcements of cutting red tape in areas like taxation and business licensing and so on. So do you think that this change in tone is really anything substantial, or is it really a matter of branding?
Well, first of all, the reshuffle was just over 2 months ago, right? So it's probably too early to judge the performance of the new ministers. But if the remarks by, for example, Minister Thomas Lembong after his inauguration is of any indication, I think we have hope. And for example, he said that we have to undo these protectionist measures because such measures actually backfires in the end. So I think that's a good sign. And these packages, as you know, the government has just launched 5 packages. Looking at the content, I think there are hopes, especially on the trade front. For example, there is a clause to not require recommendation from Ministry of Agriculture and Industry anymore for import of, say, sugar, and not requiring a double check or survey from Surveyor Indonesia for something that is already checked in the customs. So this, I think, is a good sign. But again, it's just 2 months. We never know. I hope they will walk the talk, right? So, and also now that the government, President Joko himself is now in US to persuade investors, if you like. I think it's a good sign. I mean, in the first year, people have been saying that actually Jokowi might not be very interested in international, communities, but, unlike SBY, for example. But now he's trying to, at least we see the sign that he's trying to be pragmatic and to be more investor friendly, if you like. So, yeah, there is hope.
Yeah. I'd like to just ask one issue that has really come to the fore during the first year of Jokowi's presidency is trade in agricultural commodities,
right,
and the idea of self-sufficiency or independence in food,
right,
that has become a real kind of touchstone for a lot of nationalist politicians in Indonesia. Jokowi himself has seemed keen on this, so isn't it a bit of a contradiction to have this stated goal of food self-sufficiency, yet at the same time promising liberalisation in trade?
Yeah, contradiction is a good way to put it, I think. So he has ministers, but not all of them see eye to eye. So I don't think, well, I think Thomas Lembong, I hope he will become a better trade minister, but there is this Minister of Agriculture who keeps pushing on self-sufficiency, and I think it's not the right time, it's not the right policy at the moment, especially, for example, sufficiency in all these commodities, rice, sugar, soybean, and others. And the fact that El Nino is coming, it's going to make it far worse. And saying that the stocks are enough, and we just know it's not enough because the price keeps increasing, and if the price of this basic commodity increase, it actually hurts the poor. So I'm hoping that Pak Darmin, for example, the coordinating minister, can actually, sort of navigate these different views in the cabinet towards a better outcome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just more broadly, do we think, or do we have any idea if Jokowi himself has any kind of solid convictions on economic matters, or is he simply going on the advice of people around him?
That's a difficult question, but I think well, first of all, he's a pragmatic, and I think at the end of the day, he will see that the stock is not there, and for example, fiscal space is also not enough. So, like the events in the last few days, we can see that he actually understands what was the problem, and what the problems are, and I think, well, he seems like a very good leader, but unfortunately, he probably lacks of macro narrative, if you like. So it probably takes some time, but the recent indications, I think, give us some hope that he is actually learning that things are not as good as he is being told by his, for example, Minister of Agriculture.
Eve, you've been doing research on the political economy of the resources sector in Indonesia, which is quite a mess of political economy, if there ever was one. So Jokowi did actually come to office with sort of a personal interest in reforming the mining sector and cleaning up some of the vested interests and rent-seeking that occurs in that industry. So what went wrong? Because it doesn't seem to have sort of taken place.
Yes, that's right. If we cast our minds back to the presidential campaign, Jokowi did indeed sort of sell this narrative that he was going to rid the sector, this very strategic sector of energy and mining, of vested interests. And in Indonesia, the term is the mafia. And indeed, I think in the first few months, there were really positive signs that he was committed to reform in this sector. And the first sign of progress was the appointment of Sudirman Said to the Minister for Energy and Mineral Resources. And prior to Jokowi, under SBY, we had political appointees. We had appointments of people who were widely seen as kind of political operators and corrupt indeed. And so with the appointment of Sudirman Said, we, for the first time in a long time, had widely regarded as a clean minister, a pragmatic minister, lots of experience in the bureaucracy. So that was a really good sign. He also went ahead and appointed an independent team to provide recommendations to him on how to clean up the oil and gas sector, which is notoriously corrupt, and particularly the importing of oil into Indonesia. So those were really good signs. But then I think, and we see this not just in this sector, but this contradiction and chaos, in fact, and erratic behaviour in the way Jokowi approaches policy and approaches reform. So on the one hand, he was pointing to progress, to reform, and on the other hand, at the same time, we see many cases where Jokowi has bent to the pressure of vested business interests, particularly within his own coalition. And so just to point to one case study in particular, right at the same time as he appointed this independent team to look into corruption in oil and gas imports, he then gave the green light to Surya Paloh, the head of the National Democratic Party, one of his coalition partners, to go ahead and facilitate an importing deal with Angola through one of Surya Paloh's own private business partners from China. It was incredibly dubious, terrible optics, but again, this is this contradiction that Jokowi, that we can't. He's unpredictable in the way he approaches these reforms, and I think it speaks to perhaps his own lack of understanding and naivety of the way that the rent-seeking works in the sector. But I think also it reflects a kind of superficial commitment to transparency, and there are many other cases we could, of course, point to as well.
I mean, in a broader sense, and we look at some of the way he makes decisions that affects the interests of people around him, is he well aware that he's being put under pressure by rent seekers and vested interests, or is it a question of he doesn't know a dodgy confidant when he sees one? What's our feeling on that?
I think with the particular case that I just mentioned, I think that, and we know this from other cases as well, sometimes Jokowi signs things that he doesn't read. Sometimes he doesn't do his research. I think it did in that case demonstrate perhaps there was a political deal made in advance. Perhaps he just really didn't understand the nature of the deal and didn't know who this Chinese investor was or this broker was. But I think in other cases, and again I would refer to the mining sector, Jokowi is aware that he is constantly managing the vested business interests of the elites around him. I mean, it's public knowledge that the Vice President Yusuf Kalla has interest in the mining sector, of course Surya Paloh, and then indeed Luhut Panjaitan, his former Chief of Staff and now one of the coordinating ministers, has direct interests in the sector. And Jokowi is constantly trying to balance these interests, but he does a very poor job of it, and it has an effect on the direction of policy and on some of the government's decisions on key strategic contracts with big big foreign oil and gas and mining companies. And I think that to a large extent what we had hoped is that Jokowi would attempt to insulate his minister from these vested business and vested political interests. And instead he's hot and cold with his minister and often abandons him. And I think that that speaks to, I think, perhaps also what Greg mentioned in terms of his own personal character as well.
I would just add to that, Liam, that sometimes I think in the foreign media an impression is given that Jokowi is something of a very pure politician and something of an ingenue. And I think one of the mysteries with him is that on the one hand he does look as if he's out of his depth politically, and we've got the case that Eve mentioned about Surya Paloh and Sampo, but in other cases we know from his time as Governor of Jakarta and Mayor of Solo that he was quite prepared to do political deals, and what's more, he was quite prepared to use sensitive information that came into his possession as leverage against parties in the local parliaments to make sure that they passed things that he wanted to get through. So this was very much a practical politician at work, and that for me is one of the mysteries about Jokowi, working out at what point we suddenly get Jokowi the operator, prepared to do things that are a little bit questionable to achieve an end, and at what point we suddenly get Jokowi is the person who is compliant. And that's one of the things that I think we're all trying to work out about Jokowi at the moment.
I mean, after having piled onto him collectively over the past year, I mean, can we see anything that's worth defending in this administration? Are there any areas where he has actually used the political tools that are available to him to sort of pursue something that he really cares about?
Well, from economic front, I think one of the policies that has been applauded is the removal of the fuel subsidy. Just in 4-5 months he was in the office, and I think that's a very good policy. It was unpopular, but he did it, and of course we now want to see the effect. The saved money is now, according to the government, is given to infrastructure, which is, of course, is very needed for development at the moment. But in the future, we also want to see, reallocation for education and health, for example. So, yeah, that's one of the policies that I think he uses common sense and good politics.
Now, of course, you can't talk about Jokowi's infrastructure drive without talking about the role of China in Indonesia's foreign relations and increasingly the economy. Is there a feeling that Jokowi and the government understand the geopolitical consequences of, in some ways, quite publicly aligning themselves with Chinese economic power? Anybody?
I'm not sure whether Jokowi understands the geopolitics of cozying up to China. I think that, yes, we have seen Jokowi open the doors to Chinese investment. Certainly in the minerals and energy sector, they need investment. There's been a big push to develop the downstream industrialization of the resource sectors, and China has been a huge player in that. And they need that sort of investment. We've also seen a recent decision to choose a Chinese investor over a Japanese investor for a big rail infrastructure project in Indonesia. So we can see that the government is obviously prioritizing and is interested in Chinese investment. But then publicly, the media has been quite critical of some of these decisions, and we are beginning to see a bit of public debate about whether Indonesia should be cozying up in this way to China. But I don't know. I'm not sure I can speak to whether Jokowi himself or those in his executive are thinking in terms of the geopolitics of this. I don't know if Greg wants to comment on that.
One thing I'd say is that the Chinese have been very effective in cultivating Jokowi. President Xi went to Indonesia and spent 3 days there, which is a long time for the Chinese president to be there, in April when Indonesia was marking the 60th anniversary of the Asia-Africa summit. And so the Chinese have been investing a great deal of time in persuading Indonesian leaders of the merits of their various projects that they're putting forward. To my mind, this is one of the questions one has to ask about Jokowi. We'd previously thought that he was very development-minded and could be quite technocratic and rational. But in the case of the fast train project between Jakarta and Bandung that Eve was referring to, this is a classic case in point. The Japanese got the contract to build the subway, the MRT, in Jakarta, or they're the main contractor. And there's a sense in Indonesia that these deals have to be shared around. But if you look at Japan's record in building high-speed railways and China's record, you would say there's really no argument. The Japanese have got a superb record of reliable investment in Indonesia, high engineering standards, everything they build works well. The Chinese have got a very checkered history in Indonesia. The power stations they built often never get more than 30 or 40% of their design capacity and the like, because there are all sorts of problems with them. So by rights, if the government was doing this on the basis of merit, that project should have gone to the Japanese. And I think we've seen anger on the part of the Japanese government, which is unprecedented towards Indonesia, and indeed towards any other country, I think, for a long, long time, because they felt as if their claim was so much stronger than the Chinese. So clearly, Jokowi felt as if on this matter, some special treatment towards, some privileged treatment towards the Chinese would be a good thing. I think it's going to turn out to be a bad thing for Indonesia, I must say.
I agree that this railway incident has hurt reputation of Indonesian international forum, and so I'm hoping that Jokowi can, learn from it, and especially now that there is this new thing, TPP, which China is not part of, but also on the